welcome to Ramblin through Dave's garden. The garden is in Northern Virginia, in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It is not irrigated, so storms forecast for this evening will be greatly appreciated. Hopefully we have a couple days of storms to thoroughly dampen the soil as it has turned somewhat dry here in the beginning of July. The garden does show some signs of losing the lushness that we saw in June, but still much of it is still here. I plant very few annual flowers, relying through the summer on some perennials and a large amount of foliage, varying textures and colors of foliage. So I think there is still plenty to enjoy through July and August. And today we will take a brief tour of the garden to show some of the highlights of this first week of July. So thank you for visiting and welcome to Dave's garden. The path from the driveway to the rear deck is now practically impassable, in particular after rain when the fronds of ostrich ferns hang low. My wife was once diligent about removing fronds that hung over the paths, as well as the small amounts of ivy that creep onto the flagstones, but not so much anymore. She leaves that task to me, and of course I'm very negligent in doing such tasks. The patio, the circular patio, the first of the patios built in the garden, is now practically just a wide path, as the viridis Japanese maple that overhangs on the right side, a globose blue spruce on the left, and ostrich ferns that have spread all the way down the length of the patio overhang, and the patio is not used so much other than as a pathway, so it's not a problem, but it is quite a jungle. At one time, I believe there were well over 100 varieties of hosta in the garden, and that was going back 15, 20 years before deer became as much of a menace as they are today. Lovely to look at, but not conducive to keeping hostas. However, once the deer did diminish the number fairly severely, I did start spraying a repellent that is effective in keeping the deer from eating them. So I have been able to continue planting hostas. In the shade, as much of this rear garden is, the variegated hostas are in particular treasured for brightening the darkness of the shade. We have visited the oldest of the garden's 5 ponds previously. This pond is quite shaded. I have recently introduced small goldfish and koi transplanted from the large koi pond, which I can actually see a few of the fish through the clear water now. But at one time, the local herons pretty much cleared the ponds, the smaller ponds out. Thus, the much deeper koi pond was constructed. Now there is so much foliage surrounding the smaller ponds that I think it could be safe to reintroduce fish. Of course, I'm starting off quite small. The second of the 5 ponds constructed in the garden is a 2-level pond. The top level here is almost completely hidden by foliage. The green and blue-green hostas that you see are seedlings that appeared in the pond. I have somewhat tamed them. My wife would prefer that they be chopped out completely to be able to see the 2 small waterfalls that they obscure, but thus far I've resisted her pleas. On the lower level of the pond, a red linear lobum Japanese maple overhangs the pond. It is one of the favorites in the garden, though it hides the dark, clear water. While most of the garden has been planted, there are plenty of volunteers who have jumped into the mix, including in this area quite vigorous, sensitive ferns, and not so obvious are some large-leafed heucheras that were planted elsewhere in the garden, but somehow seedlings ended up here. That is, to me, an indicator that plants are happy when they are just finding their way into a spot in the garden and then staying there over the years. Seedling geraniums and sporling ferns join toad lilies that are planted on each side of the path that goes along the 3rd pond constructed in the garden, which is also a stream. Here is a Fatsia japonica spider's web, which I consider a tropical, a house plant until I planted it. It has been through 3 winters, one that was fairly cold with some protection, the past 2 with little cold, no temperatures below 10 degrees. It is supposedly cold hardy to 5 degrees. It has yet to experience those temperatures. So with several years in the ground, I expect that it will probably have its full cold hardiness by now. Along the stream bed, strawberry begonias, like saxifrage, and Japanese painted ferns have just appeared spontaneously, as they do frequently in this garden. A Hydrangea has sent up its flower spikes, but it is not unusual for it to wilt, very much as hydrangeas do in the afternoon heat. This was quite a hot day, and once the sun has gone down, it will perk up quickly, and in particular if we end up with the rainstorms that seem just on the horizon. One of my favorite old hostas is the Francis Williams. It is a standout in shaded parts of the garden, as is Japanese forest grass that we see at the top that is scattered throughout the garden. Many of the stones that border this narrow creek are quite mossy and completing the look that I prefer for the wildness of the garden. Plants that brighten up the shade are a considerable asset in the garden, and of course there's Japanese forest grass again, the Cuba japonica, this one gold dust. There are several other variegated plants in here. Of course, the flowers of some of the hostas, mountain hydrangea, and one of the tremendous assets for a shady garden, in particular when there is at least a glimpse of sun during the day, is some King Aurelia. Just brings excellent color to the garden. The flowers are interesting, but not its primary asset, and it does get quite large. One with a little bit more sun will get up to probably 6 feet tall. This section of garden sits beneath a canopy of tall maples, poplars, tulip poplars, and a native black gum, and it is quite shaded. In the early spring and late autumn, the camellias, a variety of camellias, provide color. During the earlier spring, green and gold and wood poppies fill many of the spaces, then followed by native and exberry azaleas for the summer. The little honey oak leaf hydrangea joins green-leafed oak leaf hydrangeas in this area that do not flower as heavily as when there is a little bit more sun than in this area. But the brightness of the foliage, even though the yellow foliage color is more muted with more shade, I did find this one, this little honey was transplanted from a sunnier area where it did scorch in the summer, so it is much happier here, even though the leaves are not quite as yellow as they would be in a little bit more sun. A more recent nuisance in the garden is the proliferation of rabbits that, as you see, hardly seem intimidated by a large human. This area, which is down from the driveway, a pathway that leads to the lower rear garden, it was completely renovated in the last couple of years, and the renovation continues. The Golden Falls Redbud was planted just several weeks ago. At the time, I did not anticipate the color combination with the Verbena bonariensis, and it is quite marvelous. With the Verbena, it is somewhat problematic, slightly, I suppose, that in removing weeds from this area, it is inevitable that 100 or several hundred Verbena are stomped on and ruined anytime walking through. But never fear, there are many hundreds, perhaps thousands left. Many of these will perhaps not even reach mature height this year, but they'll be back for more next year. When the small greenhouse was constructed, that spurred the rejuvenation of this area, and there was once a variegated silver cloud redbud that overhung a large area that it unfortunately ended up leaning and covering much more ground than it should. A year ago it was chopped out, and that is part of the area that the Golden Falls Redbud now fills that space. This will take us down to the koi pond, and one of the prized trees in the garden, a golden full moon maple. The single area of the garden that is not currently overgrown is the lower rear garden. This has been rejuvenated in the last couple of years. That started initially with the year we had several years ago with 35 additional inches of rain that saturated this part of the garden and caused the death of many favored plants. Late last autumn, I did decide to take this section of lawn in the center and to remove the grass, mound the bed so that it would have more drainage. Did decide to leave the narrow sections of lawn, which now have granite pavers through the lawn, so this area does have to be mowed occasionally. I do hope that Mazus reptans may someday take over and run the grass away. But the area in the center has been just recently planted and thus is not overgrown. I probably have overplanted it. I suspect that by this time next year it may start looking slightly overgrown, but it does have several more dwarf Japanese maples, and so perhaps it will maintain an unorganized look a little bit longer than what I think. One of the most cherished plants in the garden are the paper bushes, that is Edgeworthia chrysantha. There are several, two down in this lower rear garden are immense. I think the references will say that this is a plant that grows to 4 to 5 feet tall and 6 feet wide. The one that we're looking at here stretches more than 20 feet in width. So let that be a caution. Obviously, it can be tamed, pruned back if needed, but I rarely do those kind of things. And several plants have been moved or lost as this Edgeworthia has spread. So that is the end of today's garden tour. I thank you for stopping by and look forward to seeing you again. Goodbye.